the reason why we're gathered here today. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Bhutam dhammam sangham namasami. As Buddhist monastics, we have quite a few precepts. Bhikkhunis, so female monks, have 311, and bhikkhus, male monks, have 227. Is that correct? And it's quite interesting because usually when we say these numbers, yeah, we all kind of like look a little bit appalled. That's kind of the universal sort of reaction, like, wow. Even back home in my home country in Italy, where we have a military tradition of monasticism, even the Catholic monastics, when they hear 311 precepts, they're like, whoa, that's intense. And then they ask us, what are the precepts? What are you kind of practicing? What are these rules? And usually, in the United States, the one that, as soon as we say we're celibate, everybody's like, whoa, celibacy, that's difficult. Wow, how can you do that? And in Italy, usually it's like celibacy is kind of like, okay, yeah, sure. You don't eat afternoon. How can you do that? That's crazy. Wow, pretty intense practice. Brutal, very ascetic. No dinner. Unthinkable. And actually, my experience has been really that the most difficult thing is actually not even a precept, but it's really mostly the reality of monastic life, which is actually living in community. How can I do that? How can we all do that? It's very, very interesting. We take this form as monastics, and usually, there's a sort of, we're no longer part of society. We are literally outcasts. That's actually why we shave our heads and we wear these weird, funny clothes. Is literally to make essentially a statement that we are outside of the social hierarchy. We're outside of society. We're outcasts. And so with that, sometimes we can have, the sort of impression, maybe there are certain things that actually we might, didn't really want to kind of pursue in in lay life. Maybe there are certain things that, each one of us monastics was like, yeah, I'm really, I don't know about this family thing. I kind of like, I don't know about these children thing. I'm not sure about, this and that. And we might take this form and thinking, yeah, finally we're going to get down. We just don't have to deal with that. And that's also perhaps, if not the perception of the monastic per se, can be the perception of the lay people. Like, oh, all of these monastics, they live a sheltered life. These monastics, lots of people actually that come here go like, but I live in the real world, and in the real world, I'm like, it's pretty real to me. Not about the unreal world that I'm living in, but yeah, there's this sense that all of a sudden, with these vows, there's not anymore. We don't have to deal as monastics with these kind of sort of worldly pursuits. But yeah, spoiler. Actually, whatever we are, we think that as monastics we are trying to escape, or whatever we think as lay people that monastics are trying to escape, in reality it's actually more emphasized. It's more present. So sometimes it's actually a little bit even worse than than lay life. To the extent that, yeah, we, you know, as we go about in the world, usually, at least when I was a lay person, my life was very, very tailored. I had put a lot of effort in making sure I could avoid as much as possible that, you know, I didn't like or I disliked, or and surrounding myself as much as possible with things that I liked, with people that I liked, with people that had things in common. So all my friends, you know, were all like, kind of liked all the same things, you know, kind of liked the same music. We had shared values, shared, you know, aspirations, shared interests, lots of commonalities, all the relationships I had mostly. Sometimes I was equal opportunity, but mostly there was, yeah, like, once again, shared interests, shared commonalities. There was, you know, kind of like a honeymoon before the honeymoon was over. But yeah, so when we enter monastic life, all of a sudden we're actually like, or even when we as lay people enter a monastery, all of a sudden we're kind of like put into this like big building with lots of different people that we actually have nothing in common with, that we would actually never ever speak to if we were, I love you all, by the way. I know you're all great. Also the lay people are really great. But it's actually like a very interesting sort of situation. In fact, it can be very clumsy actually to be in a monastery, you know, when the mind sometimes tends to, you know, perhaps go into small talk, into certain habits that we have, and we might, you know, want to actually socialize with different people, and perhaps we make a joke and nobody understands the joke. Or maybe we talk about something and nobody like is really like interested, you know, in what we're saying. It's really, really interesting to actually having to kind of recreate a sort of new way of relating to people. Actually comes to mind the other day, one of the venerables actually, I think, was making a joke in the in the kitchen about something about yards or something. It was a
10-yard line.
10-yard line.
He was trying to make a football joke.
Correct. And it was, so we were a few people in the room, and I think that maybe in the States I was told that everybody would have gotten it, but I was like, miles, yards. I don't know that non-metric system. How to look at this. What is the venerable trying to say? How bizarre. They're making kind of weird signs. So the venerable looked at the other, you know, monastic, and the other monastic was also a little bit puzzled. Then so I think there was something about Super Bowl, which then I remembered was not baseball, like I believed was baseball most of my life in the United States. Right, football, which is not soccer. And then there was a layperson in the room. So then, you know, we all looked at the layperson. Maybe the layperson will know, and the layperson was like, sorry. And then one of the venerables who afterwards shared that usually he feels like he's the one who knows the least about football in the room, knew the most of football in the room. So it's kind of like this kind of like really interesting turn of events, right? Where all of a sudden the way that we normally relate to people is kind of like not available to us. And it's so interesting because then there's also not the usual way that we communicate on a more subtle level, especially here at Antiquad Monastery. Also, we have the extra layer of it being an international monastery. So except right now, actually, I'm the minority, unfortunately. I'm the only Italian. Everybody is American. Well, you're Canadian, but it's the kind of same thing. Same continent, anyway.
Actually, they get offended if you call them Americans.
Oops, so sorry. Well, No offense. But yeah, so usually there's all sorts of different layers that come where, also the way that things are said can get very much misunderstood. And it's interesting because sometimes we tend to think of like monasteries as this just a place where everybody is like meditating and being blissful and peaceful all the time, but it's actually not terribly different than any other places, just that the people that are here are committed to training the mind, are committed to cultivating peace, are committed to just become better people. But at the same time, obviously, we have to kind of interact with other people at the same time, and obviously that process might inadvertently like step on other people's toes. We might inadvertently say, just like what I just did, I just apparently offended Joe without wanting to offend him. Did not know that it was an offense to call offended but it's this like constant, bumping into each other, constantly like intending one thing and accomplishing something else. And it's just such a humbling actually experience, because we can have these very strong, strong reactions, strong emotional things, and perhaps once again at the very beginning we might have this very idealized version of the monastery in our mind. Maybe we interact with even Buddhist communities, and we're like, oh, these people are so great, they're all like lovely and nice, and but then after a while we get used to them and are like, they could be nicer, and then well, actually they're quite defiled. Actually they suck. Because our sort of level of our standard level has become significantly higher, and so our expectations. And so to a certain degree, like the same kind of dukkha that we are experiencing outside in the world comes and shows up, and it's just like all that, oh, I just wished that things were different. I just don't like this. I don't want this. This has to stop. Or we might have the feeling, well, okay, I'm done with this. I'm out of here. Or perhaps we're like, ugh, I don't know what else to do. I have to endure this sucky place and these sucky people. So I'll just shut up and quietly, endure. And it's, that's just a very interesting experience to be in. Interesting thing to think about, and also a very humbling experience to actually see how, normally we read the news and or perhaps actually we just go out and about in the world, not in a Buddhist monastery, and we're like just so appalled to see all the read about or see, read about the wars, see the war, experience discrimination, see people being discriminated, seeing all these conflicts, all this greed that happens in the world, all this confusion that is out there, and we're like, how is it possible? How is this so? How? Why do people get, in these like horrible, unwholesome mind states? But then, when we're having this, we kind of step back and we actually look at our minds, and we turn around in this room and we're like, wow, we're actually surrounded by all these like really awesome people, like the 1% of people who don't kill, don't steal, any sexual misconduct, hopefully, don't lie, don't use intoxicants, also hopefully, right? Perhaps they're also celibate, perhaps they also have other ways of restraining themselves, and still, it's so difficult to get along with them. It's so difficult to actually be at peace. It's so difficult not to be misunderstood. Not It's so difficult not to insult others. It's so difficult not to get into that kind of conflicting sort of state. We kind of have a bit of a more humbling sort of, that realization is so very humbling. We kind of go like, wow, if it's so difficult to even kind of get along in this place, if it's so difficult to not get annoyed in these sort of really awesome conditions, ideal conditions, if it's so difficult, yeah, just to become enlightened here and to be surrounded by enlightened people here. Why am I surprised that people who are not committed to restraining themselves, that people who are not committed to purifying their minds, that people who are not committed to doing any type of spiritual practice and come from all sorts of different backgrounds, different ways of seeing the world. Why am I surprised that actually there's all this war, there's all this, it's all this turmoil in the world, right? And we're like, wow, that's actually that the fire that I see out there is no different than the fire that is inside of me. Everything is on fire. All the senses are on fire. All the mind is on fire. It's just constant fire. Fire of greed, fire of hatred, fire of delusion. And so it's just a little bit of, kind of that moment of going like, oof, how can I cool this fire off? How can I tame this fire? How can I get a little bit of peace right here, right now? Not out there, but here. And it's very humbling to kind of have that sort of sense of how we're, part of this fire, and how we're surrounded by fire, and how there's this constant, sort of human experience that we're all having, human experience that we're all sharing. And also how it's possible to cool it off here and there. Maybe not all the time, not maybe 100% eradicated immediately, but how if we actually commit to these teachings, how we commit to this practice, how we commit to dealing with one another, how we commit to lowering also our expectations with others, and really like committing to the Noble Eightfold Path, committing to training the mind. We can cool it off, cool it off, cool it off, cool it off, and have these like micro moments of nibbana, micro moments of like, cold shower amidst of all this smoke, amidst of all this intensity. And this is what brings us faith in these teachings. This is what gives us an experiential understanding of how powerful the teachings of the Buddha are. Not in the sense that we believe that there is something, that we just have to endure this horrible sort of state of existence forever, and these horrible people, including ourselves, or these horrible conditions, or this horrible weather, this horrible old age, sickness, and death, but rather that there is, a way to actually, learn to understand clearly the nature of things, start to clearly stop expecting for things to be so radically different than what they can be. Stop expecting, the sort of having our expectations so high, and start lowering them a little bit, and having that kind of sense of, not that we have to just endure everything, the patience of like having to just cover everything up, but like rather stopping to expect so much from both ourselves and others. And kind of go like, we all have this shared commitment, this all shared commitment of really working on cooling our minds, and we can all support each other on the path, and we can all experience a little bit of this coolness, and keep making progress together. So anyway, this is few reflections that have come from this voluntold.
Namayang Dhammakataya Sadhukarang Namaste.
Sadhu, 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 anumodami.
Well, thank you, Ayya Soma, for that lovely Dhamma talk. And at this time, if there's any questions or comments for Ayya Soma, please go ahead.
Or the other Ben, because this one.
Actually, I thought your talk tonight was super timely, at least for us, because after coming like 9 months, for the first time tonight, we came an hour early to participate in the tea. And we actually were here 10 minutes early. We sat out in the car. We're going, oh my God, there's nobody else here in the parking lot. What if it's just us and the monastics? You know, what are we going to say to them? What are we going to do? We were all worried, like, what if we accidentally say something that offends them, or we violate a rule not realizing it, and we get banished from coming back? we literally both, you know, think of that, and then we kind of said, all right, well, the pathway to growth is becoming comfortable being uncomfortable, and that's where we said, okay, let's go in. So, and then when we got in here, you were very welcoming, and the residents, you asked us a lot of questions, and were very welcoming, and put us at ease, but we were very nervous and anxious, like coming in here.
Welcome to the club. I was very nervous and anxious. Now I have to talk. I didn't want to talk. So yeah, a lot of our experience is, a lot of the practice is actually, just stopping to take ourselves so seriously and kind of, overcoming that. And we're always constantly grasping, going towards what we like and avoiding what we dislike. And so there's lots of different interactions that, if we can avoid it, if tonight I could have avoided giving a talk, I would have avoided it. And it's not really talking about Dhamma, but it's more the thought. Now I have to speak about, have to say something smart in front of, these people. So it's like this thought that we keep on grasping about, and we feel like, actually it's not the first time, so it's kind of like becoming a habit, right? But there's still that sort of rather than a habit, it's becoming like a, how do you say, something been done for a while, but there's still that strong habit of aversion that has been cultivated in the mind, that we're always scared to do something that, it's new, or we don't want to do something that puts us in that state that is a little bit uncomfortable. And there's lots of actually, feelings that we have, like actually sensation, experiential sensations, bodily feelings, pleasant and unpleasant and neutral. But mostly we react so much towards the pleasant. Like whenever we have an experience that feels pleasant, it's not necessarily that we do it rationally, that we cling to it, but it's kind of like a sort of almost like a magnet kind of way, like I want more than that. And as soon as we instead have an unpleasant sensation, we have that, I don't want this, I don't want to do that. So it kind of like stays almost a sort of memory imprinted in our way of going about the world. So it's just completely normal to avoid, anything that is a little unfamiliar or something that we're not used to, and to keep on pursuing instead what we have an experiential, like, oh, I like touching Teddy, like the cat, he's so sweet, and that's very pleasant sensation. So the mind naturally gravitates towards that. And so we create these habits of like, oh, this is comfortable, this other thing is uncomfortable. And so a lot of Buddhist practice is actually essentially stopping to obsess about how beautiful and lovely Teddy is, and keeping on grasping that, and only wanting to hang out with Teddy alone in my room forever and ever, and having the comfort with it. Oh, that sounds like really great now that I'm talking about that. But yeah, like really observing really not acting upon constantly in this blind way versus what we find repulsive and what we find pleasant, but rather kind of retraining the mind. And a lot of the practices that we do, actually, we were sharing also earlier, a lot of the practices that that are done definitely in monastic life are to, essentially we stop choosing, what we like to do and what we don't like to do, and we do what is needed. So, for example, right now, it's not that I'm giving a talk because I like to give a talk, but it's because it's needed to give a talk. And so today, I also cleaned the bathroom, not because, well, actually, I kind of like cleaning bathrooms, but but was an acquired liking. But yeah, the bathroom needs to be clean. So that's what we do. We clean the bathroom because that's what's needed to do now. Or there's at this time, we go to puja because it's needed to do puja. So we stop like kind of doing only what we like and stopping to avoid everything that we dislike, and we kind of like reframe that and we start rewiring and recreating new habits so that we can act a little bit more in accordance with wisdom rather than in accordance with impulses.
Thank you for that talk tonight. It was very inspiring. I have such respect for all of you, and I find, you're all so enlightened, and you see things so beautifully and spiritually, and yet when I hear the word outcast, it has such a negative connotation. I mean, I understand that you have certain things that you do differently, but why are you considered outcasts?
Oh, it's on purpose.
You choose to be.
Yeah, we choose to be outcasts. Well, actually, the Buddha has chosen for the monastic sangha to be outcasts. So historically, also the only people, for example, without hair at the time of the Buddha were essentially prisoners and outcasts of society. So everybody, men included, had quite nice, luscious, is that how you say it in English? Beautiful hair. So the removal of the hair was actually a precise statement that one was outside of society. So yeah, the monastic order originally in Buddhism is not what we think perhaps today in terms of like clergy. The Buddha didn't establish the Church of Buddhism, so to speak. He was not interested in creating a sort of hierarchical order. He was not interested in establishing any kind of power structure, but rather it's just a spiritual path that leads towards a cessation of suffering. So all he ever taught, he says as much, is this is suffering, this is the cause of suffering, this is the end of suffering, and this is the way out of suffering. So bhikkhus and bhikkhunis are alms mendicants, are outcasts. So we choose to give up everything. We also, as you see, we all wear pretty much the same outfit. And if I see all of you, for example, I can pretty much guess, from what you're wearing, from like your haircut, etc., what perhaps your sort of social background is, what your level of education. Actually, not really that much because I'm Italian, but in Italy, definitely. And for you who are from this culture, there's all this information, right, that one can gather by just seeing people's clothing, people's choices. Actually, we make them. We celebrate individuality. We celebrate pretty much showing off this and that. I mean, we've created all these logos. I used to be in fashion, so I know quite a lot of it, right? So why do we have, big LV sort of logos to essentially create a status, D&G or whatever it is, right? So we can tell everyone, hey, by the way, this is my income. By the way, this is where I am in society. So With Buddhism instead, like in the monastic order, we remove as much as possible all of these cues. So we don't wear jewelry, we don't wear makeup, we don't wear anything. So you can't really tell. You can't tell who is from, you know, if one is an aristocrat, if one is working class, if one is middle class, if one is educated, if one is not educated, just by looking essentially at the monastic sangha. And that is on purpose, both for essentially for our new sense of identity, that we take this identity in order to transcend identity altogether. But also for, yeah, once again, for the lay people to relate to each one of us as, spiritual practitioners, people who are alms, who rely on alms. So we don't normally always live in nice buildings in West Orange, New Jersey. It's not. This doesn't belong to us. This doesn't belong to me, Ayya Soma. As a matter of fact, that's why I live here, because I would never want to own this place. So it doesn't belong to Matti Sudazi, it doesn't belong to Tanjaga, it doesn't belong to Samanera Metico, it doesn't belong to none of these individuals. And we're homeless, actually. We take this vow of being homeless, we take this vow of being without any type of possession, without any type of inheritance, we don't handle money, we're entirely reliant on lay people. And sometimes we live in these conditions. Sometimes we actually, sleep on the streets like we did in Italy like a few months ago, wherever we are. Sometimes people come and offer food here at the monastery. Sometimes we go around alms round. Actually, I know Boljaga is going every morning around West Orange. If you see him around in the morning, that's what he's doing, collecting alms food. So very kind people give him offerings, and he kindly comes and shares it with us. So there's this, it's a practice of simplicity. It's a practice of really like, putting everything like bare bones. So as we were talking also earlier in the reflections, it's not that necessarily we're dealing with dramatically different sort of dynamics in terms of mentally than lay people. It's not that monastics and lay people are like into radically different universes. In fact, that's why lay people constantly come and ask monastics for relationship advice, because we know a lot. We're married to multiple people across the world with zero benefits.
Karmic reward. Friends with benefits. We have marriage without benefits.
So we learn essentially to get along. We learn how to purify the mind. We learn how to constantly to really understand what is the dukkha. Where is this dukkha? Like you wake up in the morning, where is the dukkha? Like why is there dukkha in the mind? It can be just as simple as that. That's what monastic life essentially does. It's removing all the kind of fluff, removing all the sort of dust that sometimes we can get very hung up with as lay people, like like all the different things that we think are kind of impeding our perfect relationship with others, or our perfect job, or our perfect whatever thing. We remove all of that, and so we're left with bare bones. Give you a practical example of this is actually clothing. Since I used to work in fashion, I quite know a bit about it, right? So like there used to be in an industry where there was lots of different refined, for example, fabrics, and lots of different beautiful garments. So when I got into monastic life, I was like, yeah, of course, who cares? Like, this I'm clearly wearing rags. Like, there's nothing to be vain about, because there's not, of course, I was also like a little bit, laughing about some monastics can get very obsessed with like spending a lot of time in dyeing, they're robes in a particular way and cutting them, etc. And I was like, oh yeah, been there, done that, you know, fashion. I've like completely overcome it as a layperson. So then I come, and after a while, you know, at the very beginning, yeah, my practice was pretty good, and I was only getting, you know, the rope that I was given and not dyeing it. And then after a while, I was like, my rope is a little bit too orangey. This is more dark brown. Dark brown is more forest monk. Orange is a little bit more city monk. I want to be more forest monk. How about I dye my thing? And so, you know, there's that movement of mind, and then there's also the realization, I'm wearing rags. Like, I'm obsessing about rags, and this rag, this really like stupid object, can become this way of, you know, where we want to build our conceit of superiority, perhaps even just with ourselves. You know, it's not that necessarily we are showing it to others, like nobody cares what kind of robe we are wearing, but it's like, oh, I want, oh, how does this like way of putting the robe look like, and how can I, so it's the same exact manifestation. It's just that, you know, when it's, you know, Chanel bag, and when it's, you know, a kind of more articulate sort of piece of clothing, we can get actually very much wrapped up in the external qualities of going, well, that bag is superior to the sort of strappy bag, or like crappy bag, or, you know, that sort of look is more suitable than, like, we can rationalize it. But when it comes to rags, we have to start like laughing at ourselves and seeing the defilement for what it is. And so this is what essentially all of these forms that we take are really useful in really identifying how we essentially create dukkha for ourselves, how we are constantly creating all these different causes and conditions that create a result of suffering, and how if only we remove those causes and conditions, then we remove the conditions for suffering to arise. And so, yeah, we're like, okay, whatever, it doesn't matter really if their robe is better than mine, and I can just let it go. It's okay. Doesn't have to be. It's only a problem if you make it into a problem. And so in this way, we keep training ourselves. But there has to be obviously that willingness to look at the mind and not expect it to be already enlightened, and also look at others' mind. You know, we have this like, we're constantly expecting to be surrounded by Buddhas. Like everybody has perfect conduct and behavior, perfect sila, perfect samadhi, perfect panya. And then we also do that with ourselves, you know, like also when we're meditating, maybe we like the first time we've meditated, but also like the 10th and the 100th time, we're like, oh, seriously, like we have all these expectations constantly. And sometimes those expectations can prevent us from actually acknowledging, seeing what is there, seeing that there is, you know, something to be worked on, and also sometimes actually prevents us from seeing something that has already been accomplished. So we take for granted what perhaps we've already acquired. You know, with in Buddhism, we don't have, you know, the concept you only live once, but you only live multiple times without the discoverable beginning. So obviously there's lots of strong habits, that both good and bad, that according to, you know, the Buddhist perspective, we come into the world in this sort of state with already kind of this inheritance. And yeah, sometimes, you know, we have actually a lot of goodness, a lot of things that have been already very well developed, but because they're already there, we kind of take them for granted, and we think they are who we are. So perhaps we're very good, you know, at not killing, and we're like, oh, how can all those like people like be so awful at killing? They're horrible. and not actually look at the fact that we don't have any tendency of killing something. It's the product of hard work from past lives. And so perhaps actually because we overlook it, then we might start kind of following the example of others and start killing too after blaming them, or like, okay, well, how about I kill too? Or at the same time, maybe we're like, we're surrounded by people who instead are very good at not killing, but we're not that good at it yet. And so we perhaps are kind of like, maybe there are these insects and they're kind of like, there's this infestation. I don't want to deal with them. So oh, look, I opened the water, the faucet, and they're all drowning. Oops, I didn't mean to do that, right? And we are not actually willing to acknowledge the fact that we are, in fact, intentionally killing sentient beings, and that there is actually a problem in the mind that we need to essentially restrain the mind and work on developing that. So a lot of the practice, I feel, is actually acknowledging, doing that sort of assessment. Like, oh, there are these wholesome qualities and there's these unwholesome qualities. No different than, if we go right now in the kitchen, we're like, oh, this part is clean, this part is stained. Let me clean up the stain and let me keep the part that is cleaned up clean. Right? So we are very objective when it comes to sort of the physical world. We understand it. But when it comes to the mind, it's like, oh no, it's not me, or like, it just becomes so personal and so painful. And so then, oh, I don't want to look at that, and I take for granted that because everybody should be like that. So it's just not an objective way of looking at it, which is why we create even more ignorance, we create even more confusion, and we lose what what has been done that is good, that is wholesome, and we don't remove what is unwholesome. So part of it, once again, is to make that acknowledgement and then roll up our sleeves and maintain what needs to be maintained and remove what needs to, polish what needs to be polished.
Thank you so much for your talk. This may be a rather shocking statement, but I think I've had experiences that I've found very painful in every Buddhist community I've been a part of, both monastic and non-monastic. And so I think I've addressed it directly in none of them. And so it's really good to be able to bring forth the things that either we take for granted or most uncomfortable to say. And after the kind of initial jolts settles, I try to always remind myself that it's usually just an issue of communication. It's kind of like, I highly doubt that any monastic was ever trying to do anything that would cause me pain. Like, if anything, they'd say, oh no, bad karma or something like that if someone was actually at fault. And it's more that we all have our own obstacles, and someone might say something casually, and to another person that could be very wounding words. I remember when I was at Blue Cliff last April, one of the senior lay teachers was giving a talk how she was trying to be as skillful as she could, and still she said something that harmed someone else, and she realized she just doesn't know everything, and that she can't be perfect, and that's something to work on. And I was strictly vegetarian or vegan for 10 years until about a month or two ago, which is a painful decision to make. And not only was it so painful to like see people either at school or in my house, like going at the cafeteria and kind of feasting on plenty of meat, I would be very disdainful on a subtle level. And now that I can't say that I'm strictly vegetarian anymore, it's kind of a humbling moment where I can criticize someone for being hypocritical, and then I'll see that I'm enacting that same hypocrisy that I'm pointing out in them in that moment. There's actually a teaching from a different tradition of the empty boat. It's like, if you're in a boat and you crash into another boat and you see another person, you get furious at them and you want to attack them. And then you crash into another boat and you react and you see there's no one in that boat. And I say, oh, okay. And it's kind of the same situation usually, but the fire inside all of us can change it. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Elliot.
Thank you. I like this word. I'd love to learn more about it. What are expectations? Like, what's happening in the mind with an expectation that causes so much frustration and suffering? Because is there like I'll be more specific. This line from a movie kept playing in my mind when you were talking about expectations. There was this scene where they captured the king of hell and they were trying to save him forcefully. They were trying to like exorcise him or purify him. And they kept injecting him, and every time he would get angry, and then eventually they thought it wasn't working, and then he stopped and he was just like, I just need to be loved. I deserve to be loved. And they were like, what? They never heard him speak like that. And it kept, what is that like, expectation that we need to be loved? And how do we deal with that when we don't have that?
I'm not sure if I got your exactly what you're asking, but what comes to mind, actually, I'll share this reflection that came to me actually a little bit before I decided to ordain. I actually used to be a very romantic person. So it was the thing that kind of was keeping me from ordination. And there was like this kind of like sort of, even though I had been through different relationships, which actually were great until they weren't anymore. But like it was all great. Like it was like, oh, the honeymoon, fantastic, like very much in love, and then impermanence, like this sort of thing. But then I was like, I really, was very much clinging to the and they lived happily ever after. I really like that. I think I think I watched too many Disney movies when I was a child or something. So it was like, it's gonna happen. Yeah, I'm sure. It's just like need to try again. A little bit. And so I have this like whole sort of whatever abstraction of like unconditional love. Yes, I'm all about unconditional love. And but after a bunch of relationships, I actually had a whole list of like, yeah, I'm all about unconditional love, but I want the person to be creative but not self-centered, have an artistic job but not be unemployed, ambitious but not self-centered, and like there's like an endless list. I was actually very specific. It occurred to me, it dawned on me, unconditional. Oh, there's a lot of conditions for this unconditional love. It's that process of delusion where I feel like we build it up in our mind, and it's like it's very disconnected from reality. And so usually, actually, even when we talk about unconditional love, it's all about me. Actually, in my endless list of conditions, there was never like something that was talking about how I was supposed to be in relation to that person, but it was all about all the different like million qualities that they were supposed to have, and if they didn't have, it was a no-go. So we put a lot of conditions and a lot of sort of expectations, I guess, on people, as well on our parents. That was another humbling sort of moment for me prior to my ordination, of realizing how much I was expecting from my parents. And as I became, now I'm actually about the age or so that they had me. I'm like, wow, I'm a big jumbled mess of greed, hatred, and delusion. I'm also a Buddhist monastic, and I'm like constantly like working on trying to remove the defilements. Why have I ever expected my parents to be perfect? like why did I expect my parents not to be, you know, a crazy sort of neurotic mess, you know? Like, we have this sort of, yeah, idealized version of reality that is just so completely, here's reality and here is our like idea of reality. And so I think that a lot of the practice is to essentially get the two to match and go like, oh, this is how things are, of course, like duh. And yeah, and that's, you know, that ignorance creates the conditions for all of this sort of massive suffering to appear in the mind, for all that papancha, for all those expectations, for all those, yeah, missed opportunities to develop. So yeah, that's kind of, I don't know if I'm really answering your question.
I feel understood. So that's good. Thank you.
Of course. Anything else? Maybe for one of the venerables, I'm talking a lot. A few minutes. Yeah.
I studied philosophy for a long time, and I recently started studying it again. And one of the conceptual fields that I think links pretty closely to Buddhism is Stoicism, and they talk about a lot of the same topics regarding dismissing pleasure and material goods. And a big part of it is that's different is that they talk about detaching yourself from them as opposed to completely removing them from your life. And I see how it would make a lot of sense to completely remove them from your life, because the internal process of having something and being able to like actually lose it without suffering is a very difficult thing to even, I'm not even sure if it's possible. So but as a lay person who is not in a monastery, who cannot fully remove these things from my life, it's something that appeals to me a lot. The idea of trying to detach myself from these things. And a lot of that, a part of that, the reason why I thought about it is expectations, detaching myself from the expectations of something. And that doesn't mean that I have to get rid of them completely, but I can learn that I can be happy with them or without them. But I guess what the question is as what is the purpose of your, like, of somebody who's in a monastery's practice? Is it entirely personal to remove your own suffering, or is the intention to foster or create a venue for other people to remove it for themselves? Is it educational for lay people, or is it intended to be predominantly an internal practice?
Well, first off, thank you for your question. The first thing I would say is to be very careful whenever cross-comparing different schools of thought. So whether philosophical or spiritual. So any system of thought is effectively its own self-contained thought world, its own self-contained, self-referential set of concepts and ideas. And often there can be apparent similarities between different thought worlds. But on deeper examination, those similarities often start to break down. So one place where this comes up very often is actually in Buddhism and Hinduism. So Buddhism and Hinduism have a lot of surface level similarities, and actually we use a lot of the same terminology. But when one starts to get a bit deeper into them, it becomes clear that these are actually quite different systems. And the similarities are more surface level. So I would say actually the same thing with Stoicism and Buddhism. So I actually don't know much about Stoicism. I did study philosophy for a while in college, but I've forgotten almost all of it. And so actually I remember close to zero about Stoicism. Do any of the other venerables, does anybody here actually remember anything to any?
Non-venerable could. There's a lot of emphasis as far as similarities go on kind of detachment, maybe cultivating wisdom independent of society. There is similarities, but yeah, it's not to say that the differences aren't very, very significant too. But there is common ground.
Okay. I mean, common ground is of course lovely, but the point I'm getting to is it's important to take each thought world on its own merits and to try to understand each one within its own context. So if you try to understand Buddhism in a Stoic context or Stoicism in a Buddhist context, you'll just wind up not understanding either one. So that's the first caveat I would make. So if you're going to study Buddhism, then study Buddhism as a self-contained unit. And if you're going to study Stoicism, study that as a self-contained unit. And you can study both, just don't get them mixed up with each other because they are different things. But coming to your question, so I mean, you gave a list of different things that monasteries can be, and actually I'd say that every single one of those descriptions was accurate, and none of them are mutually exclusive or mutually contradictory. So is this a personal practice for us? Yeah, absolutely. Is it something that we do for the benefit of others? Absolutely. Is this a place where people can come to learn as a place of education about Buddhism? Yeah. Is it a place where people can come to practice with us for periods of time? Yeah, absolutely. Is our practice a way of purifying our own mind so we can be happier? Yeah, it's that. Do we also purify our own minds so that we can be more useful to other people? Yeah, it's also that. As far as the degree to which one alters one's own lifestyle, well, it's good to remember that the vast majority of Buddhists are lay people and always have been. So 99% of Buddhists are not monks. They're lay people like you. And it's been that way since the time of the Buddha, and it's probably going to continue to be that way for as long as Buddhism exists. And actually, the Buddha gave a tremendous amount of advice specifically to lay people about how to practice his teachings while still living a lay person's life. He gave advice on how to have a happy marriage. He gave advice on how to take care of your children. He gave advice on what to do with money. So the Buddha gave a lot of advice, which is not the least bit relevant to us because we don't get married and have kids and have money, but which is very relevant to people who do such things. So the Buddha's teachings are all about recognizing how we generate our own suffering and learning how to stop generating our own suffering. And it's always to do with our mind. So if you're married, well then, or in a romantic relationship of some kind, whether monogamous or polyamorous or whatever, it doesn't really matter. The question is, what are you doing within that context which is wholesome in the sense that it helps to make the people affected happier? And what are you doing that's unwholesome in that it makes the affected people less happy, more disturbed? And then you try to do what's wholesome and not what's unwholesome. And it's exactly the same in everything else that we're doing. In everything that we do, we always ask ourselves, what choices am I making that increase suffering for the beings affected? And what choices am I making that decrease suffering for the beings affected? And you always try to make the choices that cause the least harm and the most benefit. And that's not always particularly straightforward or clear, which means we also need to train ourselves to pay closer attention to causality, to have a better understanding of what does cause harm and what does cause benefit. And what does harm and benefit even mean in the first place? Again, we need to cultivate discriminative wisdom, which can clearly see the effects of our choices on the beings affected. Because again, it's not always superficially obvious. Sometimes we need to dig a bit deeper and look more deeply at situations. Yeah, and so sometimes the clearest path forward is to completely remove certain things from our lives. So, for example, for all Buddhist practitioners, whether lay people or monastics, the Buddha advised to completely remove alcohol. So this is one thing which is universally harmful. Whether you're a layperson or a monastic, remove alcohol from your life. This is not doing you any good. But for monastics, we completely remove sexuality. For lay people, the Buddha's advice was learn how to cultivate wholesome relationships. It doesn't necessarily mean you need to be celibate, but it means to be careful and considerate and thoughtful in how you apply sexuality. So to apply it in a way that doesn't hurt anyone, and optimally apply it in a way which trains your own heart in kindness and thoughtfulness and compassion, and which helps to uplift the people that are affected by your choices. So again, I don't actually see lay life and monastic life as being mutually exclusive. They're actually just, there are different ways of applying the Buddha's teachings, but the fundamental principles are not different. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it was a great answer.
Great. And we're now well over time, so I just did exactly what I'm always criticizing other people for doing, which is going over time. So I think we should go ahead and wrap up at this point. So we can end with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu,
Sadhu.